I'm just so delighted to have Katie with us. And like if you came to the summer school, we had Hannah Gurr, who gave a wonderful testimony about how things were pretty hard for her with doing social sciences at Bournemouth University. She would have loved to be with us today, by the way, but she couldn't. She had something on, but she emailed me. But like Hannah, we're now having Katie from a medical background. She is a medical doctor. She could say far more about what she's done, and she will, of course, that's the whole point. And she's married just recently to Chris Herwig. So Katie grew up in Bedford, and I know her parents, and I know the church that she was in, Wilstead Evangelical Church, which we have strong associations with. And she's now moved up to the north, to Liverpool, to the second city in Lancashire, the first being Manchester, and married, as I say, to Chris from Northern Ireland. And I don't want to say anything more, but it's just, she goes on beach missions. I've known her for many years. She does great work on the missions, and she's now going to speak to us about what she did with the evolution, how she coped with it in her medical training. So over to you, Katie.
My name's Katie, and I've just been asked to share a little bit about my experience at university. So this won't be particularly long, but I hope it will be helpful to as many people as it can be. And just feel free to ask questions at the end. But before I share about my time at uni, I thought it might be helpful just to have a little bit of background about who I am, and then what I was like at the point of applying to university. So just going right from the start, I grew up in a non-Christian family, so I have a really great mum and dad, but they weren't Christians. So growing up, I didn't have any real Bible teaching throughout my school years. And so, as is probably true for many people in today's society, I just accepted what I was taught at school about evolution, about the origin of the world, but I never really questioned any of it. And it was only when I was studying for my A-levels that I was invited along to a Christian youth group, Young Life, which I'm sure people know here. So it was here that I was taught the gospel. I became a Christian. But I think it's important just to share that when I first started going to the youth group, they were doing this series called Demolishing Strongholds. So this series is a number of sessions made by Answers in Genesis, which presented to me as a non-Christian how the culture that we live in is shaped quite dominantly by an evolutionist worldview. So as a non-Christian going, I was really challenged by this. It just made me think about how little grounding I had for my own worldview. And it was from here that I started to read more and more about the Bible, started going to Wilstead Evangelical Church, wonderful church, and eventually became a Christian. But in relation to uni, it was that series that also gave me an understanding of what I might expect at uni. And so when I went to apply, I'd only recently become a Christian, and I had three main concerns in my head. The first was I ready for uni? So I was worried that I had only been a Christian for a short while, and maybe I didn't know enough about the Bible, wasn't rooted enough in it to make a stand. The second sort of concern I had was, did the Bible really measure up to science? So this again was a concern because I hadn't read the Bible all the way through yet, but I was beginning to see the debates that were present between faith and science. And then lastly, and probably my biggest concern, was, would university destroy my faith? So I'd heard others who had sort of struggled at uni, some who had even sort of walked away from faith, and I was worried that the same might happen if I was to go to uni. So these issues actually became quite big for me, to the point that I took a year out before going to uni, just to sort of ground my faith, make sure that I'd read through the Bible at least once before I went, and just sort of be more prepared before going. But I obviously have come to uni. So I initially studied a pre-med year at Lancaster. Now I'm in my final year of studying medicine at Liverpool, and then I took a year out as well between fourth and fifth year to do a course in humanitarian studies. which I actually found possibly even more challenging from a Christian perspective than even medicine. But yeah, university has really been a sort of very encouraging time for me, a very fun time, but it's definitely had its challenges. So I remember in my first week of medicine, and actually in my first real sort of science like lecture, so I sat down in the lecture hall, and the lecture was titled "Building Life." So the slide came up, and it said, "We don't know how life started. We do know it evolved from primitive forms into more complex forms eventually, around 150,000 years ago, leading to a species that can be clearly identified as us." And then the next slide went on. If you have variation, differential reproduction, and inheritance, you'll have evolution by natural selection as an outcome. It's as simple as that. Then that same week, I had a lecture titled Gender and Sexuality. This lecture represented gender and sexual preferences as a rainbow or a scale, rather than the binary male and female that we read of in Genesis. And it was made clear during the lecture what was thought of anyone who had a sort of alternative opinion from that. So although this week was a really difficult for me as a Christian, I look back now and I know that week was very helpful because it gave me a choice right from the beginning about what I would tell people around me. So either I'd make my stand clear from the beginning or I wouldn't. And rightly or wrongly, I've never made a big stance in a lecture theatre setting, but I found much opportunity with people around me in conversations afterwards. So I found topics about evolution actually much easier to interact with because they've often began as quite an intellectual based discussion, which can be brought to the gospel. Whereas the more ethical issues such as gender, abortion, euthanasia, these have been the harder topics that I've had to engage in because they're moral based from the very start. And it's meant that people begin to sort of shape their opinion of me as either nice or not nice from conversations surrounding those issues. And these issues come up quite a lot in medicine. So a particular instance that I remember was during my second year, where we had a lecture on the Abortion Act. And the lecturer we had gave quite a clear message that anyone who believed in or anyone who believed that an unborn child had a right to life and that abortion ought to be illegal was very much still living in a Victorian age and that the 21st century had moved on from that. So this was a time that I chose to have a discussion with that lecturer. Of course, you have to do it respectfully and make sure that you are sort of thankful for what the lecturer is doing and doing his job. But I was able to just point out to him that the cohort, in the degree, would have had Christians, Muslims, other people who wouldn't have had that same position as him, and that his viewpoint wasn't really representative of the whole lecture theatre. But this conversation was actually really beneficial. It led to further discussions with him throughout my degree, has led to being able to write articles and things like that for sort of defence unions and different organisations such as those, and actually turned out to be a really productive conversation and one that was well received by the lecturer. So whilst I said I found it much harder to make a stand in lecture theatres because there can be up to sort of 350 people in those, it's been much easier in small groups where topics have come up. So on my palliative care placement in fourth year, we were asked to vote in our small groups of 8 on whether we might allow someone to end their life or not in various circumstances. And whilst I found the setting harder at the start because it feels much more personal in a small group, and you feel that you stand out much more as a Christian, it became progressively clearer that many people have similar viewpoints. And by making a stand myself, it was actually making it easier for others to do so as well. So the hardest situations that I found myself in is when topics come up that are directly against Christians. So this has only happened that I can remember sort of once to me, whereas in a psychiatry teaching session, And we had to discuss whether we might section different individuals under the Mental Health Act. So it was a very small setting. There were only 10 of us in the room. And one scenario that we were given was about a middle-aged man who was preaching in the street that everyone should repent and believe in Jesus, or they might go to hell. And this discussion was particularly hard. There were a large number of sort of strong atheistic personalities in my small group at the time, including the tutor, who had made that clear. And it just meant that I was forced into a position to make what I believed very well known in the group setting, where I knew that I would be the only one who might disagree with those around me. But although these situations have often felt like a no-win choice, so they either make you feel quite maybe isolated or embarrassed during your course, or you feel the sort of temptation to remain quiet and go along with the crowd. I think overall, it's been worth any embarrassment and awkwardness along the way. So you've certainly seen numerous opportunities for discussion, friends come to faith, and overall found a real respect from people on my course for my beliefs. So often you become quite well known as a Christian in university. So you're often known as the Christian one, or the however, and some might mock, but others I've found have been really respectful and value you both as a friend and someone who can really help them. And I think I've been really encouraged by times that people who maybe don't know don't know you personally have sort of come and said, I've heard that you're Christian and I just really want some help with this situation in my life, really struggling with this situation. And I think those sorts of times have been very encouraging. So I think if I went back to myself at the start when I was applying and went through my 3 questions again, if I could answer myself back then I would say, firstly, am I ready to go to university? I don't think I would have ever felt ready to go to uni myself. But I've certainly found that by doing your quiet times each day, reading your Bible and praying, that God really strengthens you to stand firm in His word, in the truth, and that is giving me a real grounding during my time at uni. Secondly, does the Bible measure up to science? So absolutely. And one of the things that's really helped me become more confident in this is open air work. So I find that time and time again in the open air, you see how the Bible answers the questions of so many people around. And that has really given me a confidence to make a stand as a Christian at uni. And finally, will university destroy my faith? So although there are people who go to uni, maybe go off the rails a bit or lose their faith, it doesn't have to be that way. And I certainly see many people at uni really grow and strengthened. And so I guess if I would give advice from my own experience, it'd be to make sure you're reading your Bible, praying each day, finding a good local church, and getting involved in evangelism. So yeah, that is really all I have to say about my experience at uni. But I'm more than welcome sort of any questions that people might have. Yeah.
Okay, that was wonderful to hear that, Katie, and we really appreciate your sharing so honestly what's happened during your course. Would you say that it's becoming harder for people to, as Christians and people who believe in creation, to go into medicine?
I think that certainly. I think that certainly at the start, from my experience, I found that at the start it was okay. It's very much you're being taught. Yeah, you can see evolution definitely run through, but you're given much more opportunity to. You're still respected as an individual, that you can ask questions and make your sort of voice made known. I think the further going along, I've found that actually the implications of believing creation, So the implications to sort of like the outworkings of that, whether that be gender, whether that be right to life, whether that be that all those things that come from your position of believing Genesis. I think that's where it becomes harder when it comes to the application of those beliefs. So that's when I've found more troubles, is less so in the teaching and more so in the implications, even in research, sort of the research opportunities that come up and the ones that you can sort of accept or decline, because of the sort of more moral implications of them. Those are sort of the harder things that I've found to.
Can you give us an illustration of where you had to make a choice in research projects?
Yeah, so I was asked to do a piece of research that was it was looking at how embryos are used, and different people in society's right to an embryo, and obviously with sort of technology increasing, and the use of embryos in for different people, it became quite difficult to accept that research. So even though it was a sort of granted, and perhaps I could have, maybe I could have done it and sort of jumped the hurdles along the way. I decided to decline that piece of research and take a not funded one, but one that I felt more comfortable doing conscience-wise.
So there are important decisions to do with Christian conscience, which you've had to make in your work, in your studies.
Yeah.
Let me ask then, what about the Christian Union, and maybe not so much Christian Union in your case, but the Christian medics?
Yeah.
There'll be some who won't take the same view as you. Does that become very difficult when you've got Christians whom you know, and you don't doubt that they know the Lord? And none of us are saying that, of course, when we're dealing with people who say that sincerely that God used evolution, but we don't agree with them. But how did you find that as you were doing your course?
So I haven't had much to do with the Christian Union, just because I felt that I really wanted to be involved with the sort of local church at the time. But the Christian Medical Fellowship, I actually started off very skeptical about the Christian Medical Fellowship, and I've really grown to love them as an organisation.
Yeah.
Yes, there are definitely people, there are definitely people in CMF that will have a different view, but it's a very safe space that you can really talk to each other about those. And I've found that actually the majority of the time people have held to either the same view or a very similar viewpoint, especially on the outworkings, even if they haven't come from, even if maybe they haven't sort of recognized that that means that they probably take a literal view of creation, or they haven't thought about it as much, they certainly have the same outworkings more often than not. So I found them very helpful. Yeah.
If we've got medics listening to this, although he's no longer the head of CMF, but Peter Saunders has written some wonderful books on the issues of euthanasia, on the issues of transgender, on the issues of abortion, and all the other things that you're bound as a medic to meet. So that's a little plug for some of the CMF publications. It wouldn't necessarily all take, as Katie said, a literal 6-day creation view, but when it comes to the rubber meeting the road on the ethical issues, they're 100% with us. And I know Peter Saunders personally is a great man. And indeed, Truth in Science have produced the transgender DVD, which is available. You can see the trailer, you can order it. And that has Peter Saunders, who was with CMF for many years, on there. Now, coming back to you, Katie. So Katie, are you saying then that being a Christian doctor is still very much something that people, if they feel the Lord's leading them that way, is a good thing to do today?
Yeah, I certainly think that. One thing I maybe should have mentioned as well is being a Christian medical student, you probably have more liberty than when you after you qualify.
Okay.
So I've certainly found that I feel much more comfortable as a student saying no to things or asking questions because so you're not employed by like you're not employed yet. So I've certainly found it more that you're more able to actually ask questions and or say no to doing certain things as a student than maybe you are as a doctor.
So what are you actually doing now?
So at the moment, I'm in my final year of medical.
And then what do you plan to do?
I'll be
Being
good.
a great wife to Chris, but that's
Um,
you
yeah,
you're still going to plan to carry on.
yeah.
And what are you going to specialize in or go
I
into?
don't know. I have no idea. I enjoy everything, so I'm not sure yet.
Yes. So it could be difficult, you're saying more difficult once you've qualified.
Yeah, I know certainly speaking to some of the sort of speaking to some of the doctors from CMF, certainly in sort of fields like obs and gynae, or even GP, they found those specialties much more. And as a like even when picking my specialities, there are certain specialities that are maybe um, you definitely second think. Yeah.
Okay.
Before picking them.
I think we'll now move into some of the questions, and we're happy to take the questions. I see quite some of them have started coming in, and I've got one here, but it'd be good if people actually brought in others, and feel free to actually bring them verbally if you'd like to. Tony Lawn asks, does the Christian Medical Association, maybe you mean Medical Fellowship, have resources to support medical students and newly trained doctors? Yeah, I mentioned this earlier. If you go to the CMF website, there is a lot of materials that they have. And Nigel Jones could say more and may wish to on that. But if you go to the CMF website, there's a lot of materials. Katie, did you want to comment on that first?
Not really more than you've already said. Like the website's really good, and they're also very good at putting you in contact with other Christians, and that's been really helpful in sort of times that I found difficult to have a older Christian medic to be able to talk through different issues with has been really helpful.
Yeah. Any other questions? Tony's put a comment. Yes, Nigel.
Nigel, Katie, that was fantastic. Bless you. Could I just say that when you qualify and you start to work as a junior doctor, in a sense, the thing that will win people's hearts to you is, how well you do your job. WWJD, what would Jesus do? If you do it like Jesus, people will love you and respect you. And as you say, there are some specialities like general practice or obs and gynae where there are real challenges. But in much of the rest of it, there's enormous opportunities for Christians. And to Andy's question, should people go into medicine? Yes, if they're called, definitely. Jesus was a physician. He wasn't a thermodynamic engineer. He invented that, but I really encourage you in medicine. I've taught ethics for 10 years since I retired. And in a tutorial group of 18, when we're dealing with Down syndrome or spina bifida, I say to the students, how many of you here know somebody with Down syndrome? There's always 9 of the 18 do. And I say, in one word, could you describe them? And without fail, never have they ever said anything other than happy. And they don't need to say much more to win the case in a way, I mean, there are different ways of preaching, aren't there? But Katie, bless you. Keep on giving that testimony.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Appreciate your further input if you want to come in on anything. Any other questions that people want to ask, feel free. There may be some who are doing medicine. I'm not sure I've looked down the list and I can't remember what everybody's doing, but there may be 1 or 2 of you doing medicine or thinking of it. And even if you're not, just feel free to dive in. Any other comments that people want to make? I don't have any other questions that I can see, but there may be some that you want to ask. If you want to ask them verbally, feel free to do so.
I've already decided to show that to my 2 eldest granddaughters. They're not going to do medicine, but it's so important. Fantastic, Katie.
Yeah, that's very, very good. Very important. Tony makes a comment. 2 young, faithful Christian dental students asked Dr. Job Martin, who's a very well-known creation speaker in the US, had he ever considered creation? This was before he became a believer in creation. And as a result, Job Martin became a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ and believed in creation. So what you as a student say to your lecturers, that's the point of Tony's comment, can have a huge impact, and it did, on Dr. Job Martin, who now has spoken widely on creation and been used greatly by God. So don't feel that you cannot say things to your lecturers. Does anybody else want to come in on this point about how one should approach your lecturers? Remember, Hannah Gurr made a similar point when she, those of you who heard her in the summer, said that she spoke respectfully but firmly to her lecturer about some of the things that he was saying. And basically, she won the argument, but she did it very, very carefully and respectfully. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Perhaps you've had an experience yourself, not necessarily in medicine, but maybe in the other subjects that you're doing. Just a little opportunity for you to say something if you wish. Well, if we don't...
Andy?
Yes, Vinny.
Vinny here. This is just an observation. I'd like people's comments, and it's a question. You see, when you listen to Nigel Farage, whether you like him or not, is a man of convictions.
True.
Now, maybe he oversteps the mark and is a bit rude on occasions. I don't know. But what has helped me in evangelistic work and helped me to understand how to speak to people is, if the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, which is the book of Psalms, the non-Christian are on the back foot. But the problem is, people talk to them as though they're on the front foot. So you don't get aggressive or nasty or rude. But basically, they are on borrowed time, sat on death row, breathing God's oxygen, which he can turn off at any second.
Yeah.
And that helps me to speak with conviction.
True. That's well said, Vinny. Thank you. Now, I appreciate your point. And thank you for that, that we ought to be on the front foot, not ever think that we're on the back foot. We have the truth with us all the way. Hannah, I don't know whether this is Hannah Gurr, but it's Hannah anyway, because Hannah may have joined us. Did you find yourself, so this is back to you, Katie, did you find yourself penalized academically, that is essay scores, placement feedback and so on, as a result of your Christian stance on your course? Katie, can you comment on that?
Yeah, in medicine, no, I didn't find that actually at all. But when I was studying my humanitarian studies in between 4th and 5th year, I certainly found that more common. And I think mostly because we were marked by the same person each time we did a presentation or a essay, and he had very strong beliefs that were not Christian, and he was very at the beginning of the year. I think it was much harder, but I think what really helped was just staying firm in your beliefs when you're doing presentations, staying with it. And actually, I found my scores like massively increased from the beginning to the end, and to the point where you just have general conversations with the lecturer and the students, and just making your argument like firm and persuasive was just like really. I'm not quite entirely sure how to say what I mean, but I saw my scores like rise massively once people saw that that you're not shying away.
Exactly. No, that's a very important point you're making, Katie. I do understand what you're saying, and I just want to bring it out a bit more. As I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, to summarize what you're saying is, as soon as you'd made it plain that you are a Christian, you believe in creation, as Vinny was saying, you were on the front foot, you weren't being belligerent, but you were making it very plain that you believed, and that gave you the momentum spiritually, which fed into doing your course with confidence, and that you began to even see your scores going up. Is that a good summary?
Yeah.
So this is an important point, that we should, right at the beginning, make it plain that we believe the Bible. Let me just show you something that happened to me way back when I was a undergraduate. I actually did, very naively, I did biblical studies in a liberal institution at the University of Wales. At that point, I hadn't decided whether to do mathematics or I'd not long been a Christian, and I thought, oh, I'll go and do biblical studies. That'd be a good thing, get to know the Bible. Little did I realize how awful the course was going to be. Hugely liberal, questioning everything, certainly questioning the Mosaic authorship of Genesis. And so the very first question that the chap says when you go into the lecture is, hands up anybody who believes that Moses wrote the book of Genesis. So my hand gingerly went up with a few others, not many. And, he then sort of laid into us. But actually, I think it was very important, even though I didn't do it very easily, but I did do it, to make it plain where I stood right at the beginning. Because then people, at least, they won't agree with you, but they know where you stand. And it helps you to be confident. So I would encourage that. Thank you for that question. And that wasn't Hannah Goetz, another Hannah. Thank you, Hannah, very much for that. One other question. Graham says, Graham Picava, in discussions about the doctor-patient relationship, has the question of personal faith and testimony ever come up? That's an interesting point. Katie, do you want to comment on that? Because you're not quite there at that point, but you're going to be.
Yeah, with patients, you definitely get some wonderful opportunities with patients. I think a patient that really stood out to me was like a patient who was very suicidal who came in, and initially they were like a nominal Christian, and initially I just spoke to them about like, doesn't the Bible say, and I wasn't even talking about myself necessarily, but just saying, doesn't the Bible say X, Y, and Z? And from that, she then asked whether I was a Christian, and then you're able to speak about your faith. And she went away very thankful. She rang the surgery back up and said how sort of pleased she was to have met me, and that she found it really helpful. And that was just really encouraging. And you get numerous opportunities with patients to share your faith, to talk about Christ, and maybe not always as directly as you want to, and there have definitely been occasions where that's been frustrating, but yeah.
You're going to change on that, Katie. I think that's what's behind the question.
Yeah.
That there is law changes coming in where people can and have complained, even though initially the conversation's gone well. Then they say, oh, this doctor pushed religion at me, which wasn't the case. And then Christian Institute and Christian Concern for Our Nation have had to represent these Christian workers, doctors, nurses, who've shared at the bedside of patients and then got into real trouble. I think that's, Graham's nodding his head. So I think that's what's behind his question. Do you want to comment on that, Katie?
I mean, I've certainly found when I've asked my supervisors, and I've asked them that, I've said to them straight, I had this conversation with this patient, and you know, I hope that's okay. And so the feedback I've been given is that certainly in sort of areas like GP, that patients will come to doctors, like can sort of choose their doctors. So I know these are from non-Christian supervisors, have sort of said to me before, you know, you get some patients who come to this doctor because he's a Liverpool supporter, and some patients that come to this doctor because he's an Everton supporter, and you'll have patients that come to you because you're Christian. And that's sort of the feedback that I've been given. So I'm not sure about whether the law is changing or anything.
It's just that we detect that the pressure's coming on. I'm not saying that the law has actually now changed, but there's certainly been cases come up where people have been accused wrongly of, you know, taking advantage of their position and all the rest of it. So, but thank you for that comment. Michael, do you want to comment? Yeah.
Just comment. The taking of a spiritual history in taking a medical history is part of it. You are allowed to do that.
Okay.
Andrew Sims's book, Is Faith a Delusion, which was a few years ago, he was a professor of psychiatry in Leeds, you know, points that out. And I think you are still allowed to take a spiritual history. You do have to be careful about it. One advantage is that if you make contemporaneous notes, make notes at the time of when you have a consultation and you write them down, it's a bit more difficult for them to misrepresent you, because you can demonstrate, I wrote this on the day and this is what I said, if that's necessary. But yeah, evangelism of your patients as a sort of a priority is not really perhaps the way to do it. I've talked a few times at CMF annual conference about this, and of course my time was different. But I did have 4 patients in 38 years who became Christians, and you know, some of them are remarkable openings of God, and but you have to be winsome and be careful, but not be quiet.
I appreciate that, Nigel. And on that topic, David Owen comments on the topic of being on the front foot. I would highly recommend another book called Questioning Evangelism, not questioning the whole point. It's talking about using questions in evangelism, by Randy Newman. And he says it's a fantastic book. Thank you for that comment, David. And William Arrowsmith rightly says the health of the soul is more important than the health of the body. I think what I'm going to do now, friends, unless there's a burning